Before we can talk about editing and delivering HDR, we should talk about what it is to ensure that we're all on the same page. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. The alternative to HDR is SDR, or Standard Dynamic Range. This is what we're all familiar with and what we've been shooting and editing in since we've been shooting and editing video. In video, brightness can be measured in something called nits. SDR video has a nit range of 0 to 100, which coincides with 0 to 100 IRE for those of you familiar with that term. The maximum brightness of standard SDR footage is 100 nits. Anything brighter than that will clip. HDR, on the other hand, has a theoretical maximum brightness of 10,000 nits. Now, this is not 100 times brighter than 100 nits. The nit scale is actually logarithmic, and since perceived brightness and luminance and the ability of the human eye to perceive brightness are all intertwined here, there's no fixed way to measure how much brighter it is. But consider that 10,000 nits is probably about 10 times brighter than 100 nits. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's brighter, a lot brighter. Regardless, too, the 10,000 nit measurement doesn't really matter here anyway, because the brightest HDR televisions that we as consumers can buy today are usually in the 700 to 1,000 nit range, with some more expensive sets being a bit brighter than that. But again, remember that since this is a logarithmic scale, the difference between 700 and 1,000 is really not that much. However, the difference between 100 and 700 is extremely noticeable. Okay, so an HDR TV is brighter. So what? Does this just mean that you can watch your TV without having to turn the lights down? Well, that's part of it, but more importantly is the amount of data that you can fit into that nit range. When you have a range from 0 to 1,000 nits to edit in, you can include a lot more detail in the highlights and the shadows, and that detail comes from the bit depth of the original source footage. Conventional SDR video is shot in a Rec. 709 color space, a term you may or may not be familiar with, but we'll explore this more as we go on. That is only 8 bits. An 8-bit color space can only contain 16.7 million colors, which may sound like a lot, but it really isn't. If you've ever seen banding in a video clip of, let's say, a clear blue sky, that's because there simply aren't enough shades of blue to represent the subtle transition from the blue on, say, the horizon to the slightly darker blue at the top of the scene. HDR, on the other hand, is shot and delivered at a minimum in a 10-bit color space, which is over 1 billion colors. High-end HDR production can actually be mastered at 12, 14, or 16-bit color space as well. Put those two things together, and you have a much greater dynamic range. That's the difference between the darkest dark and the brightest bright, and a lot more color to use to fill that space. These two things together make what we call high dynamic range, HDR. As little as a few years ago, HDR TVs were niche. Today, though, walk into any big box or consumer electronics store, and the majority of the TVs on display will be HDR. Of course, like anything, not all HDR is made equally, so do your homework if you're in the market for a new HDR TV. But the difference between an HDR TV playing HDR content and an SDR TV is stunning. Notice that I pointed out HDR content. If you're watching SDR content on an HDR TV, it doesn't magically become HDR. Video has to be edited and delivered in HDR to be HDR, and then it has to be viewed on an HDR device to be consumed in HDR. And that is where this video series on HDR editing using LumaFusion comes in. I'm going to show you how to edit and deliver HDR content using LumaFusion. The first part of making HDR content, though, is shooting it. And there's basically two methods of shooting HDR. You can shoot in a log format, which then has to be turned into HDR through color grading, or you can shoot in a finished format, which is HDR straight out of the camera. In part 2 of this series, I'll cover editing in that easier, more common finished format, and then in part 3 of the series, I'll explain the more advanced method of shooting in log and grading for HDR. Many cameras sold today can shoot in something called HLG, or hybrid log gamma. HLG is a really interesting format in that it's essentially both HDR and SDR at the same time. What's actually happening is the footage is captured in a finished HDR format, meaning that it is 10-bit and high nit and full color. However, an SDR logarithmic conversion curve is embedded in the file so that it can be played on an SDR TV without any custom conversion having to be done later in post. For this reason, it's commonly used for live HDR broadcast, where the broadcaster doesn't have to worry if the viewer is watching on an HDR or an SDR TV. So, HLG is beautiful HDR, and it's backwards compatible to SDR. Perfect, right? Well, not so fast. These are the advantages of HLG. But the disadvantage is that because it is effectively a finished format, you're quite limited in what you can do in post. You really do need to get it right in camera, as you don't have that much creative or corrective flexibility in the post-processing. It's quite similar to shooting regular SDR video footage. You can do some minor corrections, but you can't push it too far before the image starts to fall apart. So that's HLG. But what about the format that many of you are probably shooting in today? Dolby Vision, which was introduced with the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 12 Pro. Well, Dolby Vision is essentially the same as HLG. It's a finished HDR format with the SDR conversion built into it that's as easy to edit as regular SDR footage. On the other hand, if you are shooting in log, then you have to do the HDR grading and the SDR conversion yourself. It's a lot more work, but you have a lot more control. We're almost ready to start editing, but we do need to talk about editing hardware. Remember in the beginning, I was talking about viewing HDR content and how you needed an HDR screen to do that? That applies to editing your footage as well, of course. If you're shooting and editing on an iPhone capable of Dolby Vision, then you're totally good to go. The iPhone 12 screen, for example, is a super bright 1200 nits, so you can edit in LumaFusion on your iPhone and see the footage exactly as you shot it. If you're editing on an iPad, it's a little bit different. This particular iPad that I'm working on today has a maximum brightness of just 600 nits. The iPad, however, will actually display the HDR content, but it's ramped down to 600 nits. This means that the footage you shot on an iPhone won't look as bright on the iPad as it did on the phone, but assuming you don't alter the brightness, by the time you output the video and view it on the iPhone again, it'll look just as it started. If you really want to see your HDR footage in all of its glory while you're editing, you could connect your iPad to an HDR TV using the Apple USB-C to HDMI adapter and enable full screen playback in LumaFusion. To learn how to do that, check out video 8-4 in this series, using an external monitor over HDMI. Then you'll see your video as you're editing on a true HDR television. Also, while it's probably going to be enabled automatically when you connect to an HDR screen, if you're not getting the HDR or Dolby Vision badge on your TV, then check the iPad OS settings. Under Displays and at the bottom, you'll see the type of TV you're connected to. Tap that and just make sure that HDR is selected. In the next two videos in this special HDR series, we'll talk about editing HLG footage and editing from log.